A new era is dawning in the Middle East. Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader for 37 years, is dead. For more than 4 decades, Khamenei cast a baleful influence across the region. His oppressive rule ended with an American-Israeli airstrike yesterday morning. State media confirmed his death overnight. The surprise strike swept Iran throughout yesterday. Benjamin Netanyahu vows to push as long as necessary to eliminate the Ayatollah's regime. Iran has attacked American bases in the region this morning, threatening its most intense offensive ever. In turn, as air raid sirens sound across Israel, Donald Trump is threatening to hit back even harder. In Tehran, both jubilation and cries of death to America. A temporary council will govern from today, but a power vacuum risks turmoil across the Middle East. The British government will give us their first reaction to Khamenei's death. We'll ask what and when we knew of yesterday's attacks with the Defence Secretary, John Healey. We'll also be joined by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Dame Priti Patel, and assess the geopolitical shockwaves with the former head of the defence think tank RUSI, Karen von Hipple, and our correspondents in the region. And what could it mean here at home? With us throughout the show, the author and columnist Lionel Shriver, broadcaster John Sopel, and the head of politics and economics at Bloomberg News, Stephanie Flanders. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. On any other weekend, we would begin this programme by reflecting on the stunning Manchester by-election victory by the Green Party candidate Hannah Spencer. Not to mention a miserable 7 days for Sir Keir Starmer, including the arrest of Peter Mandelson, that by-election beating, and yesterday the resignation of one of his up-and-coming ministers after an ethics investigation. But as so often happens these days, all of that has been swept aside by the world's scene stealer-in-chief, Donald J. Trump. Last night there was dancing in the streets of Tehran as reports spread that the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, had been killed by an American missile strike. Mr. Trump has called on Iran's people to rise up. Will they respond? No one knows yet. More than 80% of Iranians were born after the Ayatollahs came to power. They know no other form of government than Tehran's military theocratic dictatorship. But Iranians know all too well what happens to those who challenge the regime. 3 years ago, a young student called Mahsa Amini was arrested and beaten by Iran's so-called morality police for the crime, and in that country it is a crime, of wearing her headscarf too loosely. She died in custody. She was just 22. In the Women Life Freedom protests that followed, more than 400 people were killed by the Iranian authorities. There are many important questions to be asked about the legitimacy and likely effect of President Trump's actions, and we'll no doubt discuss them this morning. But it's hard to be neutral about the potential fall of Iran's rulers, who, according to the United Nations, may have murdered as many as 20,000 of their own people during the most recent wave of protests alone. The future of this young nation now hangs in the balance. We'll be hearing from the Defence Secretary in a moment, but first we can speak to our Middle East correspondent, Adam Parsons, who's live in Jerusalem. Good morning, Adam. What is the situation there now? Is that promised or threatened Iranian retaliation coming through in Israel?
Yes, it is. Morning to you, Trevor. It's coming through, and we've seen it. This morning, a succession of missiles have been intercepted here in the skies above Jerusalem. Been the same story across Israel. Regular air raid sirens wailing in this country. That happened through the night, and certainly this morning we've seen what are called interceptions. Now, that is when an Iranian missile is coming over here, and then an air defense missile from Israel's famed air defense system launches, smashes into it, and it explodes. And we've seen a series of those so far this morning, probably no more than 5 minutes before I'm speaking to you now, Trevor. 2 or 3 of those again in the sky, one enormous blast that came from just over in that direction as the missile was intercepted. So it's very clear that Iran is continuing its attacks here. Also, beyond Israel, in the wider region, we're seeing smoke rising in Dubai. I have no doubt at all that there will be further attacks aimed at the UAE and at Bahrain and at Qatar and at countries that Iran considers to be allies of the United States. But their fury, of course, will be focused upon Israel. I mean, Iran is evidently reeling at what happened yesterday, finding itself in this conflict, finding its leadership decapitated. It will launch missiles. It has talked about launching these huge waves of missiles. And I don't think there's any doubt at all that the huge military might of the United States combined with the Israelis will respond in kind. So it's a curious thing, Trevor, is that when you're on the ground, these things come in lulls. You have moments when air raid sirens are going off, when missiles are exploding in the air, and then you have moments like now, where the sun is beating down from a blue sky, and over there, a man is controlling a crane that is moving around while in this region, war is raging.
It is the weirdest thing about war zones. Quite often you can be in a place where you think nothing's happening. But you rightly refer to the spreading of this conflict. We're looking right now at pictures from Karachi, where protesters have been storming the United States consulate, where, of course, this is, of course, a country where the Shia connections from Iran are very strong indeed. Do you see this spreading across the region over the next few days, or is this just a today reaction, do you think, Adam?
I think the honest answer is that we are in a world of enormously unpredictable consequences, and I think it would be foolhardy to predict that we know what's going to happen next. And even on the streets of Iran, we know that people have been out in numbers. What is not clear is whether or not those people are out in support of the United States and Israel, or whether they are out protesting about the killing of Ayatollah Khamenei. I imagine both, to be blunt, and it is impossible for us in standing here now to know what is the balance between those things. So the questions will be, who will replace Khamenei? Could it, in fact, one of the front runners be the grandson of Ayatollah Khamenei, the original Ayatollah? How long will that process last? The president, who is now part of this triumvirate running Iran, will he take a different perspective? Will he try to reopen negotiations with the United States? How strong will be the leadership of the Revolutionary Guard as they try to maintain their grip on the country? Will people take to the streets in vast numbers? And if they do, then will they face the kind of repression that we saw weeks ago? And unless we get the answers to those questions, knowing the spread and the consequence of this, I think right now is almost impossible.
Thank you, Adam. But I suspect that with you and the great team you've got out there, whatever the answers to those questions, we'll hear them here first, because I know you're going to be on all day. Let us hear now from the British government. Just before the show, I spoke to the Defence Secretary, John Healey. John Healey, what's your reaction to the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei?
Well, I think few people will mourn the Ayatollah's death, not least the family and friends of those thousands of young protesters murdered on the streets of Iranian cities. I mean, Iran and the regime he's led for so long, it's a source of evil, murdering its own citizens and sponsoring and exporting terror, including to countries like Britain. And the concern now, of course, is that this regime is lashing out. It's lashing out in an increasingly indiscriminate and widespread way. And people will be really concerned that it's not just military targets, but civilian airports like Kuwait, hotels in Dubai and Bahrain are being hit. And so that's why we've strengthened the UK defences in the region. We're active in regional defence operations. And it's why Keir Starmer yesterday called for Iran to end this now, to give up its weapons programmes and to return to the route of diplomacy, which is, in the end, the way that we will settle a long-term stability and peace in this region.
Evil is a very strong word. We don't hear it much in politics.
20 terror plots directed at Britain, sponsored by Iran. Tens of thousands of young people, protesters, murdered on the streets in the last few months in Iran. 57,000 Iranian drones fired by Russia into Ukraine. Proxy groups that destabilise countries right across the region. Make no mistake, this is a regime that menaces other countries, exports terror, murders its own citizens, and must never be allowed to have a nuclear weapons programme. Now, my job as Defence Secretary is to try and deal with the rising risks to British personnel, British people, military and civilians in the region, to reinforce regional stability, which is what we're doing with our UK flights. We did it yesterday. We'll continue to do that, and to try and reduce the risk of escalation in the future. And that's what Keir Starmer's been doing over this weekend, talking to E3 leaders, talking to other regional leaders and to President Trump as well.
When you say that we are active, we have planes in the air yesterday. Can you say exactly what we are doing in the theatre, in the area?
I'll try and be as open as I can, within the limits, obviously, of disclosing operational details. But when our UK planes fly for Qatar, they are protecting against any missiles or drones directed towards Qatar. When they fly from Cyprus, they're doing the same from Cyprus. But of course, when our planes are in the air and they see things, missiles or drones, directed towards other countries, they'll take them down. And so when I talk about Britain playing a role in reinforcing regional stability and part of coordinated regional defensive operations, that's what I mean.
So in practice, the rules of engagement for our forces are that if there is a threat either to, for example, British bases or to the territory of our allies, Gulf states and so on, British forces are allowed to engage.
Yes, these rules of engagement, as we would put it in military terms, these operations have been in place for some time. They're coordinated across the region with other allies, and it is the UK protecting our UK personnel and bases. First and foremost, that's my concern as a UK Defence Secretary, but it's also to protect our allies, it's to protect our UK interests more widely across the region.
Are there circumstances in which we might join the Israelis and the Americans in offensive action?
Well, we've been no part of the strikes. We are concentrating the efforts that we are making on defensive actions. We've done that from the start. I moved in extra radars, planes and other weapon systems to Cyprus and to Qatar. We're flying as we speak over this weekend as part of that regional coordination. And all our actions are about defending UK interests, defending UK allies.
I understand that as a situation thus far, but what I'm asking is, are there circumstances in which you can envisage our troops, our forces, accompanying, working with the Israelis and the Americans in any kind of offensive action, or have you ruled that out completely and told the Americans that that's the case?
Well, first, I'm not going to speculate, and you wouldn't expect me to, on either hypothetical situations or potential discussions and operations. You've got plenty of commentators that can come on and do that.
No, but I think what...
let me say
this is not about commentators. This is about our people. We have their families whose members are serving. And I think they've got some right to know whether it is plausible, it is possible that they might be engaged in, let's not call it offensive action, in some positive action rather than defensive action in the region.
Well, families of our personnel serving in the region will be concerned. A lot of others with friends in the region who may be looking for winter sun in Dubai or Bahrain will also be worried. I was in communication last night with a friend in a Dubai hotel that was messaging me from the underground hotel car park as they took shelter with the air raid warnings there. No, we are already active. The actions that we take, active actions, if you like, are to defend our people, defend our bases, defend our allies, and it will always be the case that the action we take, and the action we're taking at the moment is within the established rules of engagement, will remain to defend our interests and the collective interests of other allies, and it will be within international law.
Okay, so all things are possible. Did we refuse to allow the United States permission to operate from sovereign British bases?
I'm not going to get into, and you really wouldn't expect me to.
Well, I think it's
get into discussions like that. What I can say
there
is
were such discussions.
We've stepped up alongside the Americans. We've stepped up our defensive forces in the Middle East. We're flying those sorties. We're taking down the drones that are menacing either our bases, our people, or our allies. And this is a really serious and deteriorating situation, rising risks of increasing Iranian indiscriminate retaliatory attacks. Let me give you a couple of examples. Look, yesterday we had 300 personnel on that Bahrain base that was attacked by Iranian missiles and drones, some of them within a few hundred yards of where they landed. We had 2 missiles fired in the direction of Cyprus. We don't believe they were targeted at Cyprus, but nevertheless, it's an example of how there is a very real and rising threat from a regime that is lashing out widely across the region, and that requires us to act. It requires us to act defensively, but very in a very coordinated
defensively,
way.
But actively. All right. Well, look. Just if I may, just ask you one more question about what has actually happened. Is this attack legal? Because the president says this was a defensive action because the United States was threatened. I mean, it's quite hard for the average person to see how the United States was threatened by Iran this week. Is this action legal?
Look, make no mistake, and no one, I think, generally does, who has seen the way that Iran has menaced us and sponsored terror around the world, been a source of instability in the region, is developing a nuclear weapons program, can be under any doubt about the character of this regime and it's the threat it poses. But to answer your question, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. But
if the legitimacy of this is that it's a defensive action, you're saying that. Somehow the Iranians threaten through its proxies, well, you could have said that any time in the last decade. And indeed, if that is the case, we're as much at risk as the Americans. So why aren't we actually involved in this defensive action?
We are involved we're involved in our own defensive actions, coordinated, including with the US. But the straight answer to the question of, is the US action legal? That is for the US to set out and explain. It's not for me as a Defence Secretary of the UK. I'm here to speak for the UK. I can speak for the very active participation that we have in coordinated defence across the region. And I'm speaking today also about my rising concern about the indiscriminate attacks we're seeing from an Iranian regime that is losing its command and control, with missile commanders increasingly allowed to choose their own targets. And so the risk of us seeing UK personnel and people, that's why my first priority is their protection. And secondly, to reinforce that regional stability and avoid further escalation.
Well, let me pick up something that you've said. Do you have concerns about the security situation here at home? Are we, for example, going to raise the threat level?
Well, that'll be for the Home Secretary to make any announcement on that. But I've got full confidence in our intelligence agencies and our ability to deal with the terrorist threats. They proved that in the past.
But that will be under review and under discussion today, will it?
Absolutely. When you get a regime like this lashing out in the Middle East indiscriminately and widely, hitting civilian as well as military targets, when you have some of its proxies capable of other actions on their behalf, then of course our force protection in the region is at its highest. Our alert and our vigilance in the UK is also high.
One risk is that the Iranians strike back economically. And the obvious thing for them to do is to close the Straits of Hormuz, which carries about a fifth of the world's oil trade, and that would devastate Western economies, including our own. Can you guarantee that the Straits of Hormuz will remain open and that we would take action to ensure that?
Of course, I can't guarantee the Straits will remain open, but I can tell you that it is critical to nations in the region and the rest of us, as you say. So much of the world's merchant shipping, and including the oil shipping, passes through the Straits of Hormuz, and so that's why Keir Starmer and other leaders have warned Iran not to escalate, not to attack shipping, not to close the Straits of Hormuz. And that's why we're involved not just in diplomacy, but we're involved also in the deterrence and the defensive operations that we are flying and operating with allies at the moment.
There's one clear risk, of course, which is that almost whatever happens, oil prices will rise in the short term. Is the Chancellor going to think again about her spring statement, which is meant to happen this week? Might she delay it? And even if she doesn't delay it, would it be wise to delay the rise in fuel duty, which is planned this month?
Well, first, she is watching very closely, as you'd expect, any movement in the oil prices. We've seen before, when Russia invaded Ukraine, that the price of war is so much greater than the cost of deterrence. We saw then double-digit inflation, and we're still paying higher energy prices and food prices now after that invasion. It underlines the importance of what the Prime Minister called for yesterday, which is for Iran to end this now, to get rid of its weapons programs, and return to the route to negotiation.
Yeah, they're not going to do that. There is certainly the prospect that British families are going to have to pay the price of what is going on now. And I guess what I think they will want to know is whether the Chancellor will be ready to reconsider the rise in fuel duty, which of course would add dramatically to the cost of living.
Look, we're less than 48 hours into this current conflict. The Chancellor is watching this very closely. And as you'd expect as Defence Secretary, my first concern is protecting British people, military and civilians in the region. It's making sure that we can protect our bases, we can protect our allies, but we do what we can either by defensive military action or by diplomacy to prevent the risk of further escalation and therefore a greater impact on people's living standards and prices in Britain and in other countries.
All right. It would be remiss of me not to ask you about political events this week. You suffered an absolutely devastating loss in the by-election in Manchester this week. And part of the reason that you suffered that loss was that electors in that constituency believed that you took the wrong position as a government on the issue of Gaza, on the Middle East, that you were in the wrong place in supporting Donald Trump and so on. Is there a danger now that actually by, as you call it, being active in support in some way of what Mr. Trump is doing now, that will increase the feeling of hostility towards Labour and create an even worse electoral position for you than you've got at the moment?
I don't read the results in that way. And I say that from having been on the doorsteps in Gorton and Denton. People there are still feeling the pressure of cost of living rises, and they are frustrated at the...
And they're about to raise their petrol prices again.
And they're frustrated at the pace of change. I get that. I would say that there is a risk of over-interpreting a one-off by-election result like this. I remember watching the Conservatives lose 20 out of 21 by-elections after 2010 and then go on to win the 2015 general election.
Okay.
And so I would say, look, we have to read the results right. We have to redouble our efforts to deliver the sort of change that people voted for less than 18 months ago. And remember also that as far as the government goes, we got 3 years to restore that confidence that we're there doing a decent job to make the changes they want to see.
On that spectacularly optimistic note, thank you very much, John Healey.
Okay.
On this historic morning, we're joined by our panel throughout the programme. Author and columnist Lionel Shriver, broadcaster John Sopel, and the head of politics and economics at Bloomberg News, Stephanie Flanders. Stephanie, is this a turning point or just another chapter in the history of the Middle East?
The Middle East is full of turning points and chapters. I think that you can pick your metaphor. Look, on a basic level, if you think about the most recent example we had less than a year ago of the so-called 12-day war, when Donald Trump obliterated for the first time the nuclear facilities and bombed Iran. The sheer number of missiles landing in Iran compared to that, I think it's now, even just from Israel, is, I think, treble the number in that whole period just in the last 24 hours. So it's obviously bigger than that. It raises enormous number of uncertainties. You discussed it with the Defence Secretary. I think the scale of the President's ambitions, at least in terms of what he's said about potential regime change, about calling on the Iranian people to overthrow their government, obviously much bigger than anything we've seen since, the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan. But when you think about the actual practicalities, I mean, no one thinks there is actually a plan for the US to actively achieve that on the ground in the coming weeks and months. So you can't help thinking that we will step back from this much bigger thing and still be in a sort of slightly different situation from a year ago with a lot more uncertainty, a lot more isolation of Israel potentially, but not some fundamental shift.
And this is exactly what Donald Trump said he wasn't going to be engaged in, which is nation building and regime change, and that's exactly where we are now. I mean, I'm more struck by the comparison to 2003. 23 years ago, I was in the Kuwaiti desert waiting for the invasion of Iraq. It was going to be so easy. You'd get rid of Saddam Hussein, you'd de-Ba'athify the army, and then everything, happy days, it would become a liberal democracy. And Donald Trump got elected on the back of the unpopularity of that and the kind of repercussions of that. And here we are again talking about regime change and what might happen in the future. I mean, potentially this is huge. We're looking at the financial aspects of this, the political aspects of this, the geopolitics of this. I mean,
the difference to one thing, I mean, in 2003 and with Iraq and Afghanistan, you had 70% support on the day of the invasion, the day of the start of the operation in the US. You have 80% opposition now to any kind of action in Iran.
Lionel?
Well, to your original question, I think it is huge. It is impossible for any of us to know what is going to happen. whatever we pretend. And
let's pretend.
So I think, considering that, this news just came in last night, right before I went to bed, just about to turn off the computer, and it's like, oh, wow, I don't believe it. And I think it's so new that we should at least take this moment and feel uplifted. It's a frightening time. I have no idea what's going to happen. It could all have all kinds of unintended consequences. But it is a good thing that this man is dead. Now, that said, if I were a young Iranian and I hear that Trump has called me to overthrow my government and I'm sitting there huddling in my bedroom, I am not at all certain what I am called to do, especially since the last time that I went out with my friends and protested against this government, half my friends died. So I wouldn't want to be in the place of regular Iranians who want a different regime but really don't know what to do.
We will expand on that in a moment. It is just gone 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. If you're just joining us, there is yet more breaking news. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is confirmed dead after a US-Israeli surprise airstrike in Tehran yesterday morning. The surprise strikes swept Iran throughout yesterday. Benjamin Netanyahu vows to push as long as necessary to eliminate the Ayatollah regime. Iran has continued attacking United States bases in the region this morning, threatening its most intense offensive ever. And Donald Trump has threatened already to hit back even harder. And here are some of the latest pictures from Tehran. Huge explosions that we've just seen, actually, since we've come on air. Overnight, there's been jubilation and cries of death to America in Tehran itself. We are told that a temporary council will govern the country until a new supreme leader is chosen. This morning, pro-regime protests are underway in the United States consulate, outside the United States consulate in Karachi, in Pakistan. Police say that 9 people have died there. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, has been looking back at Khamenei's life and power.
This is the last we saw of Iran's supreme leader leading the faithful in prayers. He remained defiant and bellicose to the end, just a few weeks ago threatening to sink American warships. But he was already, it seems, a marked man, targeted as part of President Trump's plans for regime change in Iran and the massive air campaign the president's unleashed. He was a wily and determined leader, fired by the zeal of his country's Islamic revolution. His personality and politics would define Iran's direction for more than 3 decades of rule. As supreme leader, he had ultimate religious and political authority over Iranians, with the final say over every aspect of their daily lives. Appointed for life, he led by divine right. But by the end, he'd become the focus of intense anger and opposition. In waves of unrest, death to the dictator was a frequent refrain for protesters brave enough to object to his totalitarian control. But he led a formidable apparatus of repression. Security services loyal to him used brutal methods to keep him in power. In the most recent spate of protests, thousands are thought to have been killed by Khamenei loyalists using live ammunition to suppress their uprising brutally. Khamenei was no stranger to dissent. Disputed presidential elections in 2009 provoked a period of instability that undermined his authority. Street protests erupted, turning deadly, with authorities using force to stay in power. Internationally, Khamenei viewed the West, and in particular the United States, with contempt and paranoia. But it was conflict with Israel that best defined the last years of his life and ultimately led to his demise. 2 years ago, he oversaw Iran's first ever direct attack on his arch-enemy. Khamenei said Iran had demonstrated its power after firing hundreds of missiles and drones in retaliation against an Israeli strike on its embassy compound in Syria. He vowed to destroy Israel, and he failed. Months later, in the summer of 2025, Israel launched a massive assault on Iran, initially assassinating top military and nuclear figures. Iran hit back before the US struck top-secret nuclear sites. The 12-day war didn't just damage Iran and show its inability to defend itself, it also damaged Khamenei's reputation. For once, he seemed to have no answer. Khamenei supported Hamas's October the 7th attacks. He spent decades cultivating Iran's proxies, funding the likes of Hamas in Gaza, Lebanon's Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Yemen. The 2025 war was based on limiting the country's nuclear power, a long-running ambition for the Ayatollah. He had agreed to a deal in 2015 to limit Iran's nuclear activities in return for an end to sanctions. But the Ayatollah's hostility towards the United States remained. Sanctions were lifted, but Iranians saw no improvement, taking to the streets again. The Ayatollah was quick to blame enemies in the West for the unrest. Then President Trump pulled out of the deal, leaving Iran's economy isolated and the supreme leader furious.
Trump will die and his body will turn into ashes and food for worms and ants, but the Islamic Republic will continue to stand.
Anger over Iran's ailing economy saw more clamour for regime change and yet more violence, the Ayatollah personally calling for demonstrators to be crushed. Nationwide demonstrations over the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman killed in police custody, led to a violent and merciless clampdown. Hundreds were killed after calling for the Ayatollah to go. Khamenei was utterly defiant as his citizens were killed in the streets.
The enemies thought they could uproot the tree of the Islamic Republic. That small tree has now turned into a massive tree. Anyone who even thinks about uprooting this tree is completely wrong.
Khamenei's final period in power unfolded amid renewed nationwide protests, with demonstrators taking to the streets over economic hardship, political repression, and demands for fundamental change. The unrest met by a heavy security response and an internet blackout, forming a defining backdrop to the end of his decades-long rule. Old and ill, Khamenei refused to bend to the will of his people. But it was outside forces that would in the end be his undoing. Iran's enemies that he called Little and Great Satan, but who have now had the final word. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News.
Lionel Shriver, John Sopel and Stephanie Flanders are still with me. I should add quickly, by the way, that the fuel duty rise I mentioned in our interview with John Healey is actually coming into force in September, not later this month. Just to be clear, I was asking Healey whether the Chancellor might make an announcement this month rather than make the change this month. Now, John, a lot of people say about Donald Trump that he always asks the right question but comes up with the wrong answer. I think everybody seems to agree that it's good to have got rid of this particular leader. But is this the right way?
I mean, look, I thought it was particularly hollow when you hear the Iranian ambassador at the UN complaining that hundreds of civilians may have died as a result of the strikes, and you think of the thousands of protesters that have died at the hands of the Iranian regime. They were awful, awful people. What Donald Trump has done seems to me, the biggest gamble of his presidency so far, by a long chalk. Because if you look at what he said in the statement that came out on Friday night, Saturday morning, it's we're going to carry on with this, where it's about regime change. We want the Iranian people to rise up. This isn't going to be a one-off. There could be American casualties. All of those things are the sort of commitments that Donald Trump has done everything to avoid. I mean, you look at the sort of lifting of Maduro in Venezuela. I mean, that was neat, it was quick, it was brilliantly executed, but it was kind of one and done. This looks like it could go on, and it will involve America. It will then, how will public opinion in the US react, let alone what the consequences are for geopolitical stability. And, Donald Trump has been badging himself for the past year as the peacemaker and can't understand why he's not won a Nobel Peace Prize. He's set in motion something, and it's hard to see. And as Lionel absolutely rightly said, we don't know where this ends.
We're hearing the words quagmire and Vietnam being tossed around today.
The trouble is there is no organized opposition. Khamenei has made sure there's no organized opposition, and therefore the state still has a monopoly on the means of violence, and that's how you stay in power. And I've always been astonished how long an utterly corrupt, even inept and criminal regime can stay in power just because they have the guns. And, Iran does not have the U.S. Second Amendment.
Are you thinking, Stephanie, that we may be in this situation? What after Iraq, everybody said the real problem was no exit strategy, no day two plan.
I mean, I think even in his comments in the last, he's done a couple of interviews, Donald Trump, in the last 24 hours after that Truth Social video. I think it's quite possible. I don't think there's any desire to have a really long-running, messy conflict with Iran, with the regime. I think the very emptiness of the exhortation to the Iranians, which we know is very unlikely to produce anything because there's no organised opposition. I mean, remember, in Venezuela, where there was an organised opposition, he went out of his way to say, don't try and do anything, we're going to work with this regime. He's left very open the possibility that they could go back to the negotiating table. What he wants to be able to say, and I think this is what sort of America First is beginning, we're now realising, is about a sort of muscular assertion of American will, that he can say, I have changed that regime. It is now working in a way that's more conducive to US interests, and in this case, Israel's interests, because that's been a big part of this. So I'm not so sure. It does seem very much at odds with all the messaging of his campaign and and certainly it's the fact that it's so close to where all these kind of neoconservative adventures were that was so unpopular. I think it is amazing he's taking the risk. But I think the goal is quite different, actually.
Is there a case for saying, I frequently find myself putting the case for Donald Trump in this studio. Is there a case for saying, John, taking on what Stephanie's just said, that the Maduro-Venezuela playbook was not regime change, but it was to change enough of the regime to put it in American hands? So Mr. Trump regularly now says he is in charge of Venezuela. He probably would say the same thing about Gaza. Is the idea here, do you think, that actually not to get rid of everybody, not to kill off the IRGC, but to make sure that they are malleable and pliable and will do what America wants?
Look, if he is able to pull that off with no regional consequences, and you get rid of a brutal dictatorial regime which has been funding terror groups around the Middle East and been threatening kind of people around the world, including Britain, then of course it would be an astonishing victory for Trump to be able to declare. But we just don't know quite, are the IRGC going to just suddenly, the Revolutionary Guard's going to roll over? They're promising hellfire and brimstone. And of course they're going to say, America is going to say, look, the response has not been as intense as we anticipated. But the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain have been targeted, and Iran still has a considerable missile stockpile. So, if Donald Trump can pull off regime change and we get a more amenable, friendly kind of Iranian...
It's not necessarily that it would be less brutal. He would just want to be able to point in certain ways. It would make if it makes some move in the negotiations, and he can say they have now moved in our direction.
Sure, there is no windy rhetoric about spreading democracy and kind of in the way that there was in 2003.
Is this a development of the, I think it was Panama, Somoza remark where somebody in the American administration said he may be a complete bastard, but he's our bastard.
Yeah.
What do you think, Lionel?
Well, I do find it a little unlikely that everything goes according to what little plan there is, and suddenly we have a democracy in Iran and we're overseeing elections, and they bring in...
Stephanie's saying there's no chance of that happening.
Right, and they bring in the crown prince as a kind of godfather to make sure everything goes well. I mean, it's a nice story. I don't write that kind of story because it's a fairy tale. So I just come back to, we have no idea what's going to happen. And in any case, I think Trump is going to, unless it's a complete disaster, which is possible, Trump will get credit for taking Khamenei out.
Do you think, I talked to John Healey about the issue of threat levels and so on. Should we be worried that the fallout from this is going to end up on British streets?
I think there's always that concern, and indeed US streets. And given the kind of atmosphere in US street, in some cities in America now that Donald Trump's even encouraged, you'd obviously worry about also that the way he talks about foreign threats on US soil. I would worry about that. But I do think it's also about, if you step back, Israel has kind of got what it wants here. But it is also, when you think about the last year and a half, actually quite isolated now. The vacuum left by a strong Iranian regime with lots of allies in the region, lots of proxies, is being filled by sort of Saudi Arabia and others who are trying to have a sort of loose coalition, quite focused on concerns around Palestinian statehood, all of these things. They're very nervous about Israel's strength, and that in the end is going to be potentially quite damaging for Israel.
All right. OK, it is sort of breakfast time, so I should apologise for the use of some choice language when I quoted an American official a little earlier. But anyway, a little earlier this morning, I spoke to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Dame Priti Patel. Shadow Foreign Secretary, were the Americans and Israelis right to launch this attack?
Absolutely, they were, and it's a position that my party supports. We have to remember, Trevor, that the Iranian regime has been a murderous, barbaric regime, sponsoring terror around the world and also threatening our own country. And that's been long established in terms of threats to the United Kingdom. With many of their proxies, they've also been funding and fueling the hate marches that we've seen across our country. And we should not mourn the loss of the Ayatollah one bit at all. He has been heading up and leading a murderous regime that has murdered tens of thousands of their own civilians and citizens just for speaking up for their freedom.
There are British citizens and people who are relatives in this country out there. What is the advice to them now, do you think? Or what should be the advice?
Well, of course, it's a concern in time because, Britain has many. In the UAE alone, we have over 240,000 British nationals there, and they should all be registering on the FCDO website. I appreciate that it might be frustrating because I understand there are some delays with that, but register and follow all the advice in country as well as the advice of the British government. We have our bases out there, we have our armed forces, our men and women are out there, service personnel, and obviously a lot of Brits work and live in the region. So, on that basis alone, it's important that the British government make sure that everyone is informed about the situation in the region and that we work with our allies in the region as well, and we support those countries at a time when they are on the receiving end of strikes from Iran.
I talked to the Defence Secretary, John Healey, this morning, and he said that we were active in the area, but active defensively. What should we be doing militarily?
Well, first of all, in response to the Defence Secretary's comments about active involvement, that, of course, is in the role of striking down many of the cruise missiles that have come into countries such as Dubai or the UAE and Bahrain. But at the same time, look, my party's position is clear. This is an absolutely barbaric regime in Iran. And the issue has been about why has Keir Starmer not actually worked with our American allies to be much more proactive? And, on the basis that a lot of intelligence is shared between our two countries, the Americans would have easily shared, and rightly so, details of their plans. Why were some of our bases not used? And, basically, was the British government asked, about use of our own military bases in the defensive strikes that took place? Well,
the Defence Secretary won't tell us whether we were asked, but he says they cooperate. But the big question, I suppose, in government will be, is the action legitimate? Now, President Trump says that the United States was under threat in some way, and this is a defensive action. To the untutored eye, that seems quite a stretch.
Well, actually, I don't think it does. there are a number of points to make here, Trevor. First and foremost, the British government would have been notified and information would have been shared by the Americans about the threats. That's just a fact. That does take place government to government. The other point to make, certainly from a British perspective and also from an American perspective, Iran is a threat to both our countries. We know that. We absolutely know that through the hostilities that they participate in our own countries. But also, let's look back to last year, the threat of nuclear weapons, the threat of the ballistic missiles, all the hostilities that have taken place. In January this year, things fundamentally changed when Iran itself, as a regime, were murdering its own citizens, and they had all the warnings, while at the same time refusing to retreat from their weaponry, their nuclear missiles and their ballistic missiles. That was not a regime to be trusted in good faith or anything of that nature. So the Americans took the decisions, along with Israel, they took that decision. Britain would have been fully aware of that. And the fact of the matter is that the United Kingdom government once again chose to sit on the fence, as they did last year, at a time when the region, and British nationals are also in the region, would have been caught up in this too.
Isn't there a danger here that all of that might be right, but actually we are creating a situation where there's more instability and we end up with something worse?
Well, of course, look, none of us can predict what would follow. And any military intervention comes with risk. We all know that. This is about the regime that was in place in Iran, and by the way, still is in place with the IRGC. This is a brutal regime that is a threat to us. There's no question about that. Okay. Threat to Israel, America, and ourselves. And by the way, to our allies in the region, we've seen these missiles in Bahrain, in Qatar, in the UAE. This is where we have our own equities. This is a choice that the British government has made to sit on the fence, as they did last year, even though we have been under threat constantly from this brutal Iranian regime.
You mentioned the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They are notoriously able to stretch their tentacles, as it were, abroad and to support terrorist acts and so on. As a former Home Secretary, how concerned are you about the threat to our security here on British soil? And would you be raising the threat level?
Well, I think first and foremost, the government should absolutely be concerned, and their most important measure that they could take right now is the protection of our homeland. That is the duty and the responsibility of the government. So they will be, I trust that they would be absolutely looking at every single aspect of the threat levels and the security implications for our country.
Would you expect it to be raised?
Well, that's based on information and evidence that goes to the Home Secretary, to the Prime Minister and key people in government. So they will have the information on that. The point to make alongside this, Trevor, is, of course, Iranian proxies do operate in our country. And I would argue and question the government as to why have they not taken the action against the IRGC. There are Iranian representatives of their regime in this country. They've not been expelled from our country. Call them an ambassador or whatever you wish to call them. What has the Foreign Secretary done on that basis? There's very little action that the British government has taken thus far that should have taken. And I have said this in Parliament at the beginning of the year. My party would work alongside the government to fast forward emergency legislation to bring in the prescription under the new measures, because there's been a review that's taken place by Jonathan Hall under new measures, because this is urgent. That's how you protect your homeland, and that's what we should expect of the British government.
Priti Patel, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
A little bit more breaking news. We'll get this all morning. Iran's President Pezeshkian says that Tehran views revenge as its, and I'm quoting here, legitimate right and duty, and will do its utmost to fulfill this duty. Revenge is its legitimate right and duty, and they will do their utmost to fulfill that duty. Lina, that feels like a rather direct threat to Western countries, the United States and us.
Yes, and I have to agree with Priti Patel that the least that the UK can do is to expel anyone who represents or is in the Revolutionary Guard and to proscribe that organization. I have a feeling the Starmer government is going to be very careful, though, as to how aggressive they are on this point, even rhetorically, much less practically, because they're going to be mindful of the Muslim communities in Britain. And, I would say, if I were Muslim, I would be celebrating the death of Khamenei, because he was brutal not only to Western allies, but also to Muslims. He killed thousands and thousands of Muslims. And this is a freeing of a Muslim nation from tyranny. But I'm not convinced that Muslims in Britain are necessarily going to look at it that way.
Well, we'll no doubt hear a lot more of that during this week. But John, talking to John Healey, he was very, very careful in the way this support to what Lyle has just been saying, very careful to say that every action that we take is defensive.
Yeah. I mean, look, you go back, I made the comparison to 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, and there had been a UN resolution, and then there was the battle over whether they could persuade George W. Bush to have a second UN resolution. They couldn't. But Britain felt there was enough legally to back the US action. This time, there is no UN resolution. And so you've got John Healey saying, you asking him the right question, which is, do you think it's lawful what they've done? He said, well, it's not for me to say, it's for America to say. I don't remember the British government having so many difficulties after Russia invaded Ukraine. I'm not drawing a parallel between the two, but we do say whether we think things conform to international law or not. And it was very striking that John Healey absolutely ducked that question. And I think that in the absence of a UN resolution being sanctioned, Britain won't want to get involved in offensive actions unless Britain comes under attack itself. And so for the moment, I think it's going to be sitting this dance out.
I have to say, this may not be a popular position in Britain, but I think international law is fundamentally a fiction. It is used when it is convenient and it backs up what you want to do. And when you go ahead and do it anyway, then it's ignored. A law that doesn't have an enforcement mechanism is meaningless.
Well, indeed. We discussed this on the programme a couple of weeks ago, and I think that what it is probably fair to say is that when we talk about international law, we're not talking about something passed by Parliament. We're talking about a series of conventions and agreements and so on. And I guess it is always open to any country to decide they don't want to support it.
To defy it. And let's face it, we're in the Trump era, which is all about power and realpolitik. And the last thing that's going to keep Trump up at night is whether or not what he just did is in violation of international law.
All that is true. And clearly international law has always been, honoured in the breach. There's been, double standards. But to your point, it's not always about enforcement mechanism. It's about what is an established, established norm that countries can do? And I think the question you always have to ask with Donald Trump is two questions. The first is, what is the actual impact of his actions? But I think we should always also remember, what is he giving license to have the US operate in this way without countries, for obvious reasons, jumping to say it's illegal, and also gives license to an awful lot of other regimes feeling that they can act exactly the same way, unilaterally in response to anything that they want.
Well, indeed. I was going to ask you, Stephanie, there are people whispering that, of course, all of this is being viewed from Beijing in a particular light. It's another building block that allows them to say, well, Taiwan.
Well, and also that we are actually doing more to be a consistent and sort of stable player in the international system than the US. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Taiwan, all questions of sovereignty.
Look, the rules-based order has always been a bit of a myth, but it has been at least a guide. And that, so you can have, postmarks along the way to say, well, you can do this and you can't do that. And there are limits. And so if you just say we don't need the UN at all, then the UN becomes utterly irrelevant. Now, maybe it has, but it's, there needs to be something in a sense to say that there is some sense of a world order and a rules-based order. And of course, Donald Trump is very happily challenging that and seems to be unbothered by the consequences.
I mean, I take your point that China could use this as a pretext to justify going into Taiwan. But of course, they're not parallel situations at all. The U.S. is not taking over territory in the Middle East, whereas if Beijing goes into Taiwan, they will indeed occupy that island.
All right. Yesterday's strikes against Iran by the United States and Israel had been expected for weeks, but of course they still came as a surprise. So why now? And what next for the region? Well, I can speak now to the former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, Karen von Hipple. Good morning, Karen.
Good morning.
Can we just start with that question? Why now?
Good question. I think it's hard to anticipate why Trump does something when he does something, but I think most of us had a feeling it was going to kick off this weekend. If you move that much military equipment into the region, it's the largest buildup of military force since the 2003 war in Iraq. You either have to use it fairly soon or you have to remove it. And he would look weak if he removed it. And I think he's becoming kind of predictable. He did something very similar last summer when talks were underway with Iran, and he said, we'll give it 2 weeks. And then after 2 days, he bombed. And so everyone was anticipating it would happen, not during his State of the Union speech on Tuesday, and a few other things were happening, but most people thought it would kick off over the weekend.
Can I just ask you a couple of semi-technical questions? The issue of legitimacy, of course, is going to be discussed a lot. In what sense could Iran be considered a threat to the United States?
Well, I mean, it's the usual story. It's a concern that has been underway for decades now, really. It was the threat of building a nuclear bomb. The negotiations were underway to get that under control. And then, of course, Trump was coming up with all sorts of other reasons. He said, they're chanting death to America. Well, they've been doing that for decades. He said they killed a bunch of Americans in Iraq. Well, that was also a few decades ago. And, the U.S. tried to deal with it at the time. They didn't deal with it very well. But it was almost like he was grasping at straws to come up with an excuse for doing something he wanted to do. It's very strange, though, in some ways, because, of course, as we all know, he campaigned on avoiding military entanglements in the Gulf, not making mistakes like George Bush had in Iraq. And here he is, enamored, like others have been, of his military equipment and what it can do. He's almost like a kid who's gone into the Hamley's toy store and is so excited by what he can play with. Well, so that's really the challenge.
If you accept that the war aim here is to remove Iran as a threat to the United States, to Israel, to degrade its capacity to, let's call it, cause trouble, can that be done through the use of air power in the way that we are seeing, and which both the Prime Minister of Israel and the President are promising that this is going to go on for a while?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think most analysts would say air power alone doesn't work. Air power needs to be combined with usually boots on the ground, but there's always the exception to this rule, and we just don't know yet. Trump does things in a very different way. There always is the possibility, it's unlikely, but there is a possibility that a significant bombing campaign that decapitates a leadership that is able to disable enough of the Revolutionary Guard and militias, which that's already a challenge, could leave enough room for the street to rise up and try to do something. It's difficult. There's no real organized opposition. It's more likely to lead to looting and anarchy like we've seen in so many other places, all the way back from Panama in 1989. We saw it in Iraq. We saw it in 2003. We saw it in Kosovo after the NATO bombing campaign. So that's more the typical scenario. But, things can always turn out differently. We just don't know. And so, I'm always nervous about going too much by past experience because, of course, something different could happen. I mean, in a sense, what happened in Venezuela was quite interesting. In some ways, it was smart that they did not bring in another leadership right away, because that's usually the period where you can really cause a lot of damage. Now, let's hope that there's a plan to have elections and to change the leadership. And if they're doing it sequentially, that could be a smart thing to do. So it's really hard to predict what could happen in Iran in the coming days. And they may end up stopping the bombing campaign in a day or two. You just don't ever know with Trump. And I don't think Trump knows what his plan is either.
Well, it's interesting that you say that they might well have looked back in history. And of course, the United States history with Iran goes back to 1953 with the toppling of the Mossadegh regime and then the Shah of Iran and all of that. Do you think, though, that this, what appears to be a kind of emerging theory of change, let's call it the decapitation strategy, was in some senses in the White House's mind post what they did in Venezuela, and that in some way the idea here is that not to create a new regime that is democratic and liberal and all the rest of it, but to create a situation in which Iran becomes amenable to American interests and needs.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what he's doing in Venezuela, but that's not what he's saying. He's saying you've killed civilians, you've been evil to your people. I mean, if you really say that about a regime, you don't want to leave them in place. And I don't think the population would stand for it this time. I think the population would see this as the opportunity, and he is calling for them to go out on the street and institute their own government. So it isn't the same as Venezuela in that respect, but it's not clear to me he has a plan for how to get from A to B. He's almost saying, we're doing the heavy lift and then you guys do the rest. And that can work. But I think as your panel was saying earlier, and as we've seen in so many other cases, it's highly unlikely. I think we'd all want that to work. I think we all agree that the regime has been incredibly nasty and dictatorial and over many decades and incredibly bad for their own people. And the Iranian people deserve better. But getting from here to there it's quite a journey.
Karen, one of the things that we don't really know is how robust the Iranian regime is. Everybody says that the IRGC has its structure. It's not going to collapse overnight. It's not going to be like Venezuela. There's uncertainty, I guess, about what the people will do, whether there'll be people on the streets and so on. What do we know about the other side of that equation? How long can the Iranian regime itself hold out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I think we've seen that they're planning for multiple layers of replacement, something like 4 levels down. So if 3 people get killed, they even have the 4th person designated. But that doesn't mean it'll work that way. I think, when the writing is on the wall, you may end up seeing people just fleeing for the hills. And we've seen that in many other places too, where all of a sudden, it's just over so quickly. When dictatorships fall very quickly, we have seen in the recently Syria, of course, at that point, Syria was not in control of the entire country. They were in control of parts of the country. And so, I think we hear this a lot. People say that about Russia or other dictatorships, North Korea, et cetera. But, every place is also different. And every place could end up really showing us something quite unique that we haven't seen before. So, yes, but it would be incredibly complicated because it's been so entrenched over so many decades. To clean that up and to really democratize it, that would be an incredibly complicated process. But the Iranians are incredibly sophisticated people. I have no doubt they could do it. But the question is, how do you get from here to there? And there are a lot of potential stumbling blocks along the way.
Karen von Hipple, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Okay, our panel, Lionel, John and Stephanie are still here. John, you've reported on some of these kinds of situations over many years. What's your sense here? Is this open to collapse, or is this going to be a long, drawn-out struggle?
Look, we've made the comparison to 2003. The other comparison is to 1991. And George H.W. Bush's first, when they were getting the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And then they encouraged a Kurdish uprising and said, it's time for you to take on the Baathists in control and Saddam Hussein. And America left the Kurds to their own devices. And there was the most brutal put down of the Kurds by Saddam Hussein, and the Americans were nowhere to be seen. I'm just saying that, when I hear Donald Trump saying it's time for the people to rise up, as Lionel has said, they don't have the weapons, they don't have the means, there's not a political structure in place, and there's not a clear opposition. There's Ali Pahlavi, who's, descendant of the Shah, who is kind of waiting in the wings, but we don't know how much support he commands in the country. And so I think that just to say it's time for the people to rise up, great, but will America be a consistent support to those people if they do rise up? And, as Karen was saying, with Donald Trump, you don't know that.
What do you think? I mean, we are going to try, hopefully we're going to be able to hear at least secondhand from what is happening inside Iran in a moment. But Lionel, if you had to make a bet, do you think that they're going to, that the IRGC, the existing structure, as John says, has got some, if you like, what they call in industry, some layers of redundancy, that it's got legs still?
Well, I'm not a betting woman, so You can't have my money either way. But on money, the most cheerful little detail I ran across in the news was the fact that the elite in Iran, even before this hit, were starting to move billions of dollars out of the country. And I don't know whether to interpret that as hedging your bets or whether that means they're on the way out.
What do you think?
I think this is, we would have said any time in the last 6 months, this is a massively weakened regime. If you think about Iran in terms of its regional influence, even 2 years ago, much weaker. And now inside the regime, also under threat, much weaker. But you do have that really solid, built up over all these decades, ideological foundation for the government, which was actually, not there in the case of Maduro. There was much more of a sort of classic party political situation, kleptocrat. So I think that also makes it different. I'm sorry, I still just think that all of this talk of regime change just feels very empty from the Americans.
What about the other players here? I mean, in Venezuela, Venezuela had Cuba. That was it. But Iran, of course, has a relationship with Russia, sending the drones. China has money in Iran, I think, and a close relationship because of oil supplies and so on. I have no idea about North Korea.
I would say there is one way, when you step back from all of these policies, there is one way that you can view, or at least there's one consequence that is common to all of these, and that is to show to Putin's allies that his alliance is not worth very much. You have Venezuela, Cuba now extremely isolated. Now Iran has found out that it gets a kind of phone call of support from the Russians, and that's about it. Good luck. Syrians. So I think if you could step back and say that is something. If you're trying to establish that and isolate Russia in a certain way, or indeed force Russia to be more accommodating to the West, this is one way you pick off the alliance.
All right, we can go now to Sky's geopolitical brain. Deborah Haynes, you may remember that a few weeks ago we talked about this amid widespread protests against the regime. We spoke we spoke to Fariba Hatrudi, who we're not going to be able to talk to right now, but we can talk to our own Deborah Haynes. Deborah, what are you making of it? What do you think is going to happen next?
Well, it was interesting, your interview earlier with John Healey, in which he was talking about how the regime is, in his words, sort of lashing out in an increasingly concerning way with those missiles and drones that are being fired against, from the regime perspective, US and other targets in the region. But of course, it's raining terror down on civilians in countries like the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and of course across Israel. And the Defence Secretary did say to you, didn't he, that the UK forces in the region, he talked about how they've bolstered up defences with these warplanes that are there. There are also radars to detect incoming munitions, and as well, I understand, counter-drone units on the ground to defend British interests and those of allies. And I also understand that actually yesterday in Iraq, a British counter-drone unit shot down an Iranian drone that was threatening a coalition base in Iraq, which housed British personnel. So that's the first confirmed strike by British forces in response to Iran's retaliation to the US and Israeli war. Now, the British are not playing any part, John Healey said, in those offensive operations against Iran. But of course, the UK and everybody else with interests in that region are having to deal with the consequences of that. And Britain is clearly ready to defend itself, though, of course, as you and I have talked a lot, the UK only has very limited capabilities when it comes to dealing with attacks from the air. And so, yes, we've obviously got very capable counter-drone units, but when it comes to Iran's other munitions, such as those ballistic missiles that it has still got significant stockpiles of, that would pose a much bigger problem, challenge for the UK.
It struck me, Deborah, talking to John Healey, he used this formulation several times, actively defensive. And it struck me that in the Prime Minister's statement yesterday, the emphasis was on the defensive, but in what Healey said this morning, there was more emphasis on the activeness of our contribution. Is there something that we should know here, that actually our forces are perhaps more engaged than we've been given, if you like, a sense of?
It's the reality of war, unfortunately. And as soon as a war begins, and after Donald Trump decided to launch the operation yesterday, then it sets off events that can quickly escalate out of anyone's control. Iran, of course, would have been anticipated to fight back. And as soon as that happens, then, like it or not, the UK and other allies that might well not be involved in the actual offensive action against Iran inside Iran are then caught up in the fallout. So when Iran is launching missiles and drones towards UK interests, then of course UK forces aren't just going to sit passively and watch that happen. They are going to need to intervene. And John Healey said to you, didn't he, that there were 2 missiles being launched yesterday in the direction of Cyprus. He said he didn't believe that Cyprus was the target, but Cyprus is the site of a large British airbase, and clearly there's going to be huge concern about defending other British interests in the region, and the UK has made clear that it wants to help its close allies in the Gulf too. But like I said, there really is a limited, finite resource that the UK has as well when it comes to getting involved in this, which is again why there is such nervousness about the consequences of this operation.
OK, Deborah, thank you so much for that. No doubt you'll keep audiences abreast of all of this during the day. Now, you regular viewers will remember that a few weeks ago, amid the widespread protests against the regime, we spoke to the Iranian activist and author Fariba Hakhtroudi. She vividly described a feeling of despair and rage, particularly amongst young people, towards a supreme leader whose stranglehold on power had lasted most, or indeed all, of their lives. And Fariba joins us again now. Good morning, Fariba.
Good morning, Trevor. Thank you.
I remember, actually, toward the end of the interview we had, you said, slightly with a tone of disbelief, that what you were hearing from people in Iran was that they would welcome American strikes. Now, the reality is there. Is that what you are still hearing?
As I told you, Trevor, the reaction, which was totally understandable after this bloodshed, in fact, the first reaction was, let them come, and let us finish with this filthy regime. And but now the reality, it is there. Still, there is certainly some people that they are happy about what's going on, but the more and more they are worried about what next. I mean, killing, of course, Khamenei, nobody will cry for him. But I heard recently, very recently, lawyers in Iran, activists of human rights, saying that we would have rather prefer to take him in a court, in a real court. But more above all that, they hope, what they call the collateral damages won't hurt much more people. It seems right now it is not the case, but nobody knows yet. And another worries about the people is the radicalization of the society. As I told you last time, the violence comes up wildly, and that is very worrying. There are people that really think that there is a fear of a civil war. There is a fear of who is going to take over after that. There is a fear that after a week or 10 days, they will deal again with a part of this regime.
Fariba, Donald Trump has said to the people of Iran, now is your time, now is your opportunity. This is your one chance. Rise up, take your government. How is that going down?
Yeah, I mean, with bare hand. Just 2 days ago, yesterday, they start treating people, telling, don't come to the street, believe us, you will be treated again like like the enemies, like the support of the enemies, like Israelis and Americans. And people they don't trust anymore. At the time when they were in the street and Reza Pahlavi and then Trump said, stand up, we're coming. They didn't. Now, after I don't know how many days, they are attacking Iran very, very widely. They want to cut off with the head of this regime. They openly says that there is a change regime in Iran, but for what? And the change regime, we attack, we bomb, and after you go barehanded again. You know better than I. There is more than 300 soldiers, Revolutionary Guard, plus the police, plus the... Everybody knows, I'm not an expert, a military expert, but if they don't go inside Iran on the field, you can't make a change regime like that. Yeah. Then all that is very adventurous. There is a lot of people inside the United States, you should know better than I, even inside Israel. I can name some of them. There is a historian, Avner, they said... We
probably shouldn't, Fareeb.
Sorry.
Fariba Haghtrudi, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you to you.
All right, let's return to our panel, Lionel Shriver, John Sopel and Stephanie Flanders. A quick correction from last week's programme. First, this is what happens on live shows. Last week, I said that 3/4 of pensioners were asset millionaires. Of course, I misspoke. I've got to set that straight for all the pensioners like me. The correct figure suggested by data from the Office of National Statistics is 1/4, not 3/4. What happens when you get old? Now, Stephanie...
Are we going to talk about numbers now?
Yeah, don't trust me with any numbers anymore.
Speak for yourself. I have not quite become innumerate.
We are supposed to have the spring statement from the Chancellor this week. Number one, is it worth it? And number two, how is this weekend's event going to affect that?
So on the second, we're obviously going to be looking at the oil price. There's possibility that the oil shocks are not what they used to be in the Middle East because we have a lot of other sources of energy now, particularly in the US. But if we have seen a lot of tankers now holding back from the Strait of Hormuz, it's not closed, but I did see that there's been one attack on a small tanker off Oman, so there's a lot of uncertainty about it. If we see a big spike in the oil price, then that will add a bit to inflation, and that's obviously, it comes at a very unfortunate time because we're otherwise on a path to lower interest rates. Otherwise, as you know, the Treasury has been very keen to explain that there's nothing to see this week. We will see potentially some positive news come through on some of the revisions of the forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility, but they are determined that this would be a non-event and that we should consider, they've succeeded in the sense that we haven't had lots of speculation around things that might happen. So I don't think there's any chance of any change, for example, in the fuel duty or any significant move in policy.
Lionel, one of the things that struck me about this, of course, is that, as Stephanie says, in the old days, oil shock, oh my gosh. But, of course, we should remember that the United States now has oil from fracking, and it's now got tons and tons and tons and tons from Venezuela.
Yes, the entire oil scene has completely transformed during my lifetime. It used to be that OPEC could blackmail the West whenever it wanted to. We were their supplicants. It gave them enormous power, and we hardly even hear about OPEC anymore. Still a significant source of oil, but the world is more stable as a consequence that there are many different sources of oil, and the price goes up and down. But it isn't like in the 70s, where suddenly you've got these queues of cars going, for miles, waiting to get a little bit of petrol. So, I'm glad to see the back of that situation.
The politics of it, John. No doubt there will be people in number 10 who are thrilled that we are not talking at all about what some people would regard as a catastrophe for the Labour Party in the Gorton and Denton by-election this week. But overall, good for our government or not?
So I'm sure there are Treasury boffins, as Stephanie has said, who are kind of looking at what's going to happen to the oil price and whether this has impacts on inflation. I think overwhelmingly, if you're a special advisor to this government and have seen the dismal week that has unfolded, including a ministerial resignation last night, which everyone has already forgotten about, it was a brilliant day to get that news out. I think they're probably sighing a sigh of relief. And the fact of the matter is, when it's been domestic policy, Keir Starmer has looked very vulnerable and weak, and on the international stage looks a little more sure-footed. And if the focus is on international affairs, crisis around the world, what does it mean for Britain and Britain's security? I think that's where Starmer looks his strongest.
Thank you very much all this morning for a programme which we have been flying by the seat of our pants, but stay with Sky on this dramatic weekend in the Middle East to be the best informed at your lunchtime. See you next week.